Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I hope Ramadan is going well. I'd like to extend thanks to the Mahdi Institute for your gracious invite. It's a pleasure to be here. I just ask that if anything does go wrong with the presentation, please feel free to kind of just jump in and let me know if there's any technical issues. Yeah. Okay, yeah, as mentioned, I'm Dr. Haroon Bashir. I'm the head of Islamic Studies at the Markfield Institute, and today I am going to be discussing issues regarding race and the Islamicate. In the short time that I have with you today, and as mentioned, I probably intend to speak for around half an hour, I'm going to try and get through a couple of things. In today's session, what I hope to get through is an exploration of Islam's relationship with the concept specifically of blackness, but also how we can understand conversations and debates regarding race and racism from this. So blackness as a case study of race more generally, so to speak. Specifically, what I'm going to run through are the discursive formations regarding the curse of Ham. So some of you may be familiar with it. For those who are not, the narrative runs that the Prophet Noah curses his son and his progeny to blackness and slavery. How can we understand this? How has it been understood historically? We'll have a brief look at that. Towards the end, I also want to touch on a genre of literature I refer to as Black excellence literature, and what this also means for our understandings of blackness and race within the Islamicate. Finally, I'd like to close off with a discussion regarding how these arguments have been and continue to be deployed in debates regarding Islam, Muslim communities, and the Islamicate more generally. So I hope it will be enjoyable, and hopefully I won't get grilled too much at the end, but let's see how it goes, right? Okay, so to start off with then, here's a quote from Amit Shah, the president of the BJP. He famously said, "We will remove every single infiltrator from the country," obviously referring to India, "except Buddha, Hindus, and Sikhs." Now, of course, the BJP is notoriously known to be openly hostile towards Muslims and proudly Islamophobic in their outlook. It might appear slightly strange to begin a presentation that seeks to explore blackness in the Islamicate with a quote from the BJP. However, I'd suggest there exists a link between the question of blackness within Islamicate history and the claims of Amit Shah. You see, in the minds of whether we're talking about politicians, dons of the academy, or perhaps even some Muslims, Islam has an intimate and enduring link with a concept of Arabness. And this often leads to a way of thinking which renders Islam as foreign and invasive to anywhere that isn't quote unquote Arabia. Consider, for example, that in BJP ruled India, it's become common to attack Muslims by labeling them as Arab slaves, invaders, and infiltrators as though they're foreign. Interestingly, similar slurs have been used against Uyghurs in China and the Rohingya in Myanmar. Now, the enactment and reenactment of Islam as a religion of Arabs percolates and permeates lots of political and cultural discussions, and I've made reference to that, but it's profoundly enmeshed within academic works on the topic of Islam and race also. Okay, within academic literature, Islam has consistently been framed as a religion of the Arabs that's been hoisted over non-Arabs. Of course, the trope of the religion being spread by the sword. And numerous works, in fact, use the term Muslim and Arab synonymously. Islam is constructed as an extension of Arabness and an invasion into anywhere that isn't Arab. Of course, what Arab has signified historically within different contexts is seldom explored within such works. So in this sense, an exploration of blackness in Islam is also a question of who Islam belongs to and where it belongs, along with the BJP, for example, saying Islam doesn't belong in China, and the BJP saying Islam doesn't belong in India, and the Chinese saying Islam doesn't belong in China. There are also scholars, for example, in Iran who attempt to argue that a pre-Islamic Iran was a golden age of the Persianate that needs to be returned to before Islam/Arabs ruined it. So hopefully by the end, we'll have responded to some of these discourses and placed them within their context, and then hopefully some of this will make a little bit more sense in terms of where these discourses are coming from and their trajectory also. Okay. So generally, what we can see within academic works on the subject, on the issue of Islam and race, is that many works tend to reproduce essentialist narratives regarding racial hierarchies that lend themselves to Eurocentric readings of history. So a good example of this is Bernard Lewis's famous Race and Colour in Islam. Now, within this work, Lewis focuses primarily on negative depictions of Africans from Arab authors. The book doesn't explore, for example, the Malian empire of Mansa Musa, who's estimated to be the richest man to have ever lived. Nor does it assess the renowned scholarship of Ahmed Baba from Timbuktu, or any number of the remarkable and noteworthy feats of Black Muslims in Africa. Rather, Lewis proceeds to juxtapose Islam, slavery, and Blackness with 20 of the 24 paintings illustrated within the work depicting Black slaves with white/Arab masters. Now, the fact that the majority of slaves within the Islamicate were not African or Black is conspicuously overlooked. And rather than highlight the complex nature of colour within the Islamicate, Lewis surreptitiously implies that Muslim lands were awash with anti-Black sentiment, and the narratological arc of his work situates the Islamicate as the location in which the kernel of anti-Black racism was nurtured. Now, of course, Lewis is not alone in this type of an endeavour. His prevarications are representative of a larger discourse that projects the sins and iniquities of European colonialism onto the Islamicate. For example, we can see within these types of works the types of arguments that come forth. The argument that Europeans were taught anti-Black racism from Muslims, or the claims that slavery only persisted in Europe due to Islamic influences, or the constant lamentation from scholars who deride the dearth of scholarship on the so-called Arab-led slavery of Africans, while arguing too much attention is given to transatlantic slavery. As Salman Sayyid highlights, this type of framing paves the way for the differentiation of good empires of Europe to the bad empires of Islam, by arguing that the imperial sins of Islam are far greater than those of Western empires, or that Atlantic slavery was a lesser evil than Saharan slavery, or that Muslim racism is in fact more racist than Western racism. Within these works, then, there exists an attempt to construct Islam as a religion that perpetuated a type of Arab racism and juxtaposes Arabness and specifically Blackness as a necessary extension of Islam, and attempts to kind of read racial hierarchies into Islamic history. In terms of this juxtaposition that can be found within a lot of the literature, I'd argue that it's fundamentally flawed to assume that the relationship between Arab and Black functioned according to the same logics as notions of white and Black within European structures of racism. Constructing Arab and Black as distinct homogeneous blocks whose identities were clearly demarcated ignores the fact that these identities were constantly being redefined throughout history. So Peter Webb, in his Imagining the Arabs, makes a compelling argument regarding Arabness in early Islam being heavily linked to an ability to speak Arabic properly. He argues that prior to the complete systemization of Arab genealogy, numerous tribes that were ostensibly non-Arab claimed Arab lineage and were accepted as such. Furthermore, Mahmoud Mamdani characterizes the pre-modern Islamicate as assimilationist. He argues that the fluidity of kinship led to numerous tribes adopting new identities as constructions of genealogy were flexible. In doing so, he argues that the argument basically that Arab and Black were consistently juxtaposed in the same way white and Black identities are doesn't appear to correspond to historical realities. But if we take, for example, or if we consider the fact that white and Black could never mix, which is probably best highlighted in the notion of the one drop rule in the US, which states that if a person possesses more than one drop of Black blood, they can't be considered white. So in Euro-American conceptions of race, Black can never become white, and that barrier can never be surpassed. Whereas within Islamic history, Arab clearly could become Black, and Black could become Arab, so they can't be read according to the same logic. This is further evidenced by the grammar that's used to discuss color as ethnic designation within Islamic texts. So while many scholars assume that the term Sudan, which is generally translated as Black, consistently refer to Africans, and the term Bidan refer to Arabs, the utilization of these terms historically appears far more complex. Al-Kisai in its Qisas al-Anbiya, for example, uses the term Sudan to refer to Nubians, the Zanj, Berbers, those from Sind, Hind. Now, this appears to demonstrate that Sudan had a broad context. Furthermore, Sherman Jackson points out the fact that early in the history, Arabs actually identified themselves as Black, against the generally lighter-skinned Persians, Greeks, and others that they refer to as red Ahmad. I think this is summarized best by Akbar Muhammad, who highlights the point, stating that Sudan is not consonant with black and Negro, as the latter terms are used within modern Europe and America. And I think that's the key thing to remember in this entire conversation. When we're discussing blackness and whether it's seen positively or negatively, we shouldn't simply assume and take for granted that we understand who these terms were referred to, right, are used in different ways in different contexts. And that's kind of key to much conversation that takes place within these debates, okay? So again, what I'm certainly not trying to argue is that anti-black sentiment can't be located within the history of the Islamicate. All I am saying is that the history of blackness within the Islamicate cannot be properly recovered through an exceptional focus on one aspect of it. Now, such readings can lead to problematic claims and unsubstantiated conclusions. If we take some of these quotes, for example, who are two kind of major scholars within the field, Goldenberg argues, for example, in Islamic history, it was not Canaan who was enslaved, but Black Africa. That is referring to the curse of Ham, which we'll cover shortly. The same mythic justification was then adopted from Islam by other societies in which the black became the slaves. So for Goldenberg, it was Islam that associated blackness with negativity and debasement. And as a result, implicitly, he argues that Europe actually learnt anti-black slavery from the Islamicate. You see a similar argument put forward by Sweet, who says that in Muslim cosmology, the sub-Saharan African emerged as the son of Ham, destined to perpetual servitude. The Hamitic curse provided a justification for the increasing debasement of sub-Saharan Africans. Muslim vilification of blacks was constantly being refined as blackness and slavery came to be regarded as synonymous. Muslims came to view slavery as the best condition that's best suited sub-Saharan Africans. Interestingly, again, you can see the juxtaposition, right? Muslim and African are seen as two separate entities. It's implied, but it doesn't need to be explicitly said that Muslim is also almost read as Arab. Now, as I said, I'm going to cover the curse of Ham in more detail shortly, but you can see how the consequences and repercussions of constructing Islam in this way. Now, what I would say is, while the curse of Ham was absolutely used as a justification for anti-black racism throughout the transatlantic slave trade, because it absolutely made sense to the ideology, the narrative was simply not deployed in the same manner within the Islamicate. Okay, the curse of Ham was seldom invoked by Muslim scholars to justify slavery. Rather, the linkage between slavery and blackness often caused consternation among scholarship, as slavery was justified due to disbelief and not blackness within Islamic doctrine. Therefore, according to Islamic doctrine, for example, non-black unbelievers could legitimately be taken as slaves following a war, and the Imam would have, a choice as to what to do with these people, and taking them as slaves was one of them. While a black Muslim could never be enslaved according to Islamic law, and the curse of Ham appeared to contradict this well-established belief. Therefore, statements such as Goldenberg's and Sweet's that insinuate Black Africa was enslaved by Muslims due to the Hamitic narrative demonstrate the problematic nature of projecting the history of Europe onto the Islamicate, which again is what lots of these works mistakenly do. They assume the history of Europe is universal and read the history of the world through that particular lens. Now, these problematic readings become even more clear when you look at the contradictory constructions of Muslims and race within the Orientalist imaginary. So there's a strong tendency within these works, as I mentioned, to depict Muslims and Arabs as proto-whites, the original racists, if you will, that were taking black slaves. And I mentioned the type of paintings and visual assortments that Bernard Lewis uses in his Race and Color in Islam. And you can see those types of images on the right. Lots of these types of images where you can see this white men in turbans and then black people as slaves to them. Interestingly, of course, there's a separate but equally potent elixir of the Orientalist imagination in which Arabs and Muslims are depicted as blacks in comparison to their white victims. And you can see that type of image on the left, in which a white woman is surrounded by a towering black Muslim figure. A famous example of this is Jerome's famous painting, The Slave Market, in which three visibly black Muslim slave owners menacingly surround a naked white female. Obviously, I chose not to show that, but it's interesting to see how the color of the Muslim begins to shift depending on which emotions need to be evoked. Elisha has done a fantastic work regarding color and depictions of Muslims and Jews, and she talks about her contribution focuses on how depictions of Jewish communities, especially in Morocco, increasingly became whiter in European literature as Europeans sought to seek affinity with Jewish communities. And Muslims increasingly became associated with blackness within certain strands of Orientalism. Now, she highlights the shift as within Orientalist work, Jews increasingly became seen to be victims of Arabs and Muslims. Now, when we take these conflicting views of race and Muslims into consideration, the self-serving nature of some of these portrayals becomes a lot clearer, I think. So I've demonstrated how Muslims are depicted as being anti-black at certain points. And now we can see how they're also depicted as black at others. So within this type of discourse, the Muslim takes an interminable metamorphosis. He's black enough to be terrifying when he needs to be, yet white enough to be culpable of racism and therefore used as such deflect criticism away from European colonialism at other points, as can be seen within the works of Lewis and others. Okay, so having kind of briefly run through the state of play, demonstrating how Islam is constructed in particular ways within various discourses for particular purposes, I'd like to shift to actually look at some of the texts. So fine, we've looked at how Islam's constructed according to certain positionalities and what that's been used for, but what can we see within Islamic texts? What do they actually say and how do we understand them? Okay, so the curse of Ham, the story of Noah's Ark, as I said, can be located within the Quran. However, there are no references to this narrative regarding the curse of Ham. So narrations of the curse of Ham within Islamic literature generally derive from the Bible, and specifically Genesis. So within Genesis, the story runs, Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Seth and Japheth and laid it across their shoulders. Then when they walked in backwards and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Curse you, Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brother." Biblical story has generally been understood to have developed as a justification for the Israelites' domination of the Canaanites. This perhaps accounts for the strange invocation against Canaan, the son of Ham, instead of Ham himself. The other thing you'll notice is that actually within the Bible, there exists no clear reference to blackness within the curse either. Noah curses the curse be Canaan, the lowest of slaves, he'll be to his brothers. It doesn't mention the curse was linked to blackness and where this actually came from. Unsurprisingly, some of them have argued that it was due to Islamic influences, and that's the earliest point you can see this notion of blackness being part of the curse. However, Shuki al-Hamel and others have argued that blackness can actually be seen within certain Judaic literature that far predates Islam. So it didn't actually begin within Islamic discourses. Nevertheless, the story of Ham was transmitted within Islamic literature. The fact that the story couldn't be located in the Quran, of course, didn't restrict exegetes and commentators, the Mufassirun, from narrating the tale, although it tends to be found more within works of history rather than tafsir. So, I mean, the generally accepted narrative runs that Noah conveyed the message of monotheism for around 850 years to no avail. As a result, God punished humanity with a flood, which destroyed the world. And the world was subsequently repopulated through Noah and his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, Ibn al-Athir states that Shem is the father of the Arabs, Persians, and Romans. Ham is the father of the blacks, and Japheth is the father of the Turks and Gog and Magog. Okay. Now, interestingly, Ham's blackness is considered as part of Noah's curse, as well as the malediction of slavery. Now, within accounts of Ham's curse within Islamic literature, they generally run concurrent to the biblical account that I just mentioned. There are specifically none of the Muslim side the Noah laying naked on the ark. The two dominant accounts that we can see, although, and I've written a paper on this, so you're free to kind of sift through that if you're interested in kind of hunting down some of the references. The two main dominant accounts within Islamic literature either point to Ham being naked or Ham having intercourse upon the ark, which was forbidden, and it causes Noah to curse him and his progeny to blackness. And so the time's limited, so I'm not going to run through the various renditions of this, but they do really exist, and as I said, they're quite similar to the biblical account, although all of them do mention blackness. The most interesting one's probably in Masoudi's Akhbar Zaman, when he actually changes the story a little bit in his rendition and narration, and he says that Noah curses both Ham and Japheth, and he said this is the only way we can understand it, because clearly slave makes sense. So he kind of edits the story, which is fascinating. The one other point I'd probably make about this is, while the story is clearly negative about blackness and sees it as a curse, while we're looking at texts, we should appreciate the fact that not everybody reads texts in the same way that we necessarily do, and the interpretations of these various texts kind of differ when we look at them in history. So there's a fantastic narration regarding the Harathin people who reside in North Africa, and how that they kind of interpreted this narrative within their oral histories. So within that particular story, the way they understand their blackness and the link to the curse of Ham, they argue that their people were once white, but because they loved the Quran so much, Ham held the Quran above his head, and rainfall came down on the Quran, which the ink of the Quran changed his complexion from white to black, and therefore, their blackness is a sign of their kind of link to the divine, if you will. Obviously, the fact that the Quran kind of comes after Ham isn't really considered, but within oral narratives, the point is that they ultimately read something that's ostensibly very negative, and imbibe it and kind of transform the story so it's seen as something very positive, right? So we've run through some of the curse of Ham, some of the kind of narratives regarding the curse of Ham. What I'd like to do then, as we come towards the end, is just touch on the refutations of this within pre-modern Islamic literature. And we do see strong refutations of this narrative from scholarship. The curse of Ham was contested by many Muslim scholars who found it antithetical to core Islamic belief. So the famous Ahmed Baba from Timbuktu famously rejected it as inauthentic in his Miraj al-Su'ud, arguing that slavery couldn't be linked to blackness as there's no difference between one race or another. Ibn Khaldun similarly concluded there was no scriptural justification to validate the story, and numerous scholars provided different rationales. But for the final few minutes, what I want to do is discuss specifically this literature that I refer to as black excellence. Now, this distinct form of literary production has existed for over a millennium, and it's characterized by a number of defining features. Firstly, black excellence texts all explicitly reject the curse of Ham and argue for the natural origins of blackness as a color. Secondly, they all contain appraisals of the virtue of black figures, the Manaqib of Sudan, which celebrate important figures such as Luqman, Bilal ibn Rabah, and the Negus of Abyssinia also. And all of them equally include detailed history of famous black kings, poets, and scholars, highlighting numerous instances of black excellence. So the four I'm quickly going to run through, although I don't think we'll have time to run through them all. Jahiz Fakhr al-Sudan al-Albidan, Ibn al-Jawzi's Tanwir al-Ghabash, fi Fadl al-Sudan wal-Habash, Jalaluddin Suyuti's Raf al-Sha'n al-Habshan, and then the fourth one, interestingly, Mullah Ali Effendi's Raf al-Hubus fi Fazail al-Hubus, which is a Turkish text, okay? Now, the birth of this genre caused a lot of speculation. Some commentators linked the literature with the Zanj revolt. The Zanj revolt, of course, consisted of a slave uprising against the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, some say that because the Zanj were considered black, and commentators have cautiously speculated that early authors may have penned a defense of blackness in a bid to show their support for this rebellion. The earliest and probably only surviving text of that period is Al-Jahiz's Fakhr al-Sudan al-Bidan. However, there are a number of other texts that have been lost to history, but they are referenced within secondary literature. So there's, for example, the Risala fi Fadl al-Sudan al-Bidan from Al-Ambari, the Kitab al-Sudan wa Fadluhum al-Bidan by Al-Murzubani. These were both written directly after the Zanj revolt and written in defense of the black community following the rebellion. But there are a number of others, as I mentioned. Now, the key thing, of course, is the fact that so many of these texts exist praising the excellency of blackness, and they were produced. This kind of greatly complicates and challenges this Orientalist construction and framing of Islam as a purveyor of anti-black sentiment and a religion of Arab supremacy, so to speak. Numerous Muslim scholars clearly viewed an intimate link between Islam and blackness. What I'll do is I'll quickly run through Jahiz, and then inshallah we can kind of come to a close. So regarding the curse of Ham narrative, Jahiz dismisses this. Okay, he argues that being black is not a disfigurement or punishment from God. So in the quote, he says, "We state that Allah did not cause us to be black to punish us, rather the environment has impacted us. The evidence for this is that there are also black tribes amongst the Arabs, such as the Sulaim ibn Mansur. All of these have descended from the warmest regions. All of those that have descended from the warmest regions are also black. Blackness and whiteness are impacted by the properties of the environment in the same manner that God has caused water and soil to be impacted by the proximity of the sun and its strength or lack of. The differences in color are not the result of any disfigurement, punishment, mutilation, or shortcoming." So Al-Jahiz explicitly rejects the notion that blackness can be understood as any form of divine punishment, as the curse seems to insinuate. And while he doesn't name the curses, the reference is relatively clear. In his work, he proceeds to kind of establish the virtues of the color black, citing that the most valuable copper is the darkest and the stone from paradise is also black. Furthermore, he celebrates black figures within Islamic history. As I mentioned, he points towards Luqman al-Hakim, the Negus of Abyssinia, and devotes a lengthy section to the prominent companion Bilal. One of the most unique aspects of Jahiz's argument, however, can be seen through his attempt to link blackness to the prophetic family. So, firstly, he argues that Egyptian Copts are considered black, and since Arabs claim their lineage through the Copt Hagar, Arabs have also descended from quote-unquote Sudan, because Hagar is part of that. He considers Copts to be part of the Sudan. Further, he cites that the Prophet's only son Ibrahim could also be described as such because his mother Maria was also an Egyptian Copt. Now, through linking seminal figures within Islamic theology and Arab lineage to blackness, Al-Jahiz shrewdly challenges those that denigrate blackness to reflect on the fact that not only are they denigrating previous prophets, not only are they denigrating companions, they're also denigrating members of the Prophet's family himself. Okay. Now, of course, Jahiz's work is more complex than this, and I don't want to talk for too long about that, but I just wanted to demonstrate that Muslim scholars were forcefully challenging the idea that there was a problem with blackness or black communities, whoever that might have been referring to at that time. Now, what you can see is, as I mentioned, you've got Ibn al-Jawzi, Tanwir al-Ghabas. You can see similar types of arguments used by him, Suyuti, and Mullah Ali, and I'm not going to kind of run through all of them because of time constraints. And as I said, if you are interested, feel free to have a look at my work on this. You'll find references. But just a point on the significance, Mullah Ali, for example, was writing in 17th century Ottoman Istanbul. Okay, within his work, he cites both Ibn al-Jawzi and Suyuti. His work also appears to reference another work I haven't mentioned, which is Ibn Abdul Bukhari's Ibn Abdul Baqi al-Bukhari's At-Taryat al-Munkush fi Mahasin al-Habush. Now, Ibn Jawzi produced his text in 12th century Baghdad. Suyuti penned his contribution in 15th century Cairo. Furthermore, writing at the same time as Ali Effendi, albeit on a different continent, was the aforementioned Ahmed Baba from Timbuktu. Now, in his Miraj al-Su'ud, Baba also quotes directly from Ibn al-Jawzi and Suyuti and Jahiz. Now, the fact that these scholars had access to various different copies of these works across different centuries highlights both the spatial and temporal ranges of this type of literature. Clearly, these texts were produced and reproduced, circulating widely within the medieval Islamicate. Muslims found them important. They weren't simply in a library somewhere gathering dust. And I think that's important to consider when we're having that conversation. So to conclude then, the various narrations of the curse of Ham within the Islamic tradition have circulated widely within the Western canon. Okay, if you look at some of the works surrounding Islam and blackness, Islam and Africa, the works that I pointed to, you'll find many discussions on lots of these and what it means in terms of Islam's conversation with racism. However, the few works that I've just cited at the end in regard to the Black excellence literature, Jahiz, Ibn Jawzi, Suyuti, Mullah Ali, are less frequently cited. I'd argue that this is probably due to the fact that the contours and categorizations utilized in the study of race within the Islamicate haven't shifted very much from the positions originally constructed by the early pioneers in the field, namely orientalists such as Bernard Lewis, who I made reference to at the beginning. Okay? And he's constantly seen as an authority till the day he's kind of quoted profusely. Importantly, though, the conversation is probably broader than the methods utilized by people like Lewis, nor their political machinations. Rather, the important inquiry, at least to my mind, would be why particular stories regarding discrimination against Black and African communities within the Islamicate have been produced, reproduced, and traveled so well within the Western canon. So from scholars who have been fragrantly brash with the generalizations to others who are far more assiduous and whose work has generally been beneficial to the academy, similar narratives regarding Islam and blackness have been promoted and propagated and percolated. Now, while it'd be difficult to kind of posit a definitive answer, I'd speculatively assert that the narratives regarding the subjugation of Black communities in the Islamicate have ultimately served to reaffirm a particular understanding of the history of the West and their relationship with race. In a sense, through focusing on anti-Black racism within Muslim history, the atrocities committed by white supremacy become relativized somewhat. Through reproducing the idea that the Arab Muslim world was hostile towards Blackness and was also racist, there's a minimization of the effects and implications of European empire building and the effect this had on non-white people. And a narrative in which the world as we currently know it is the world that's always been. In this sense, white supremacy becomes less of an aberration and sits neatly beside Arab supremacy, which equally deserves attention. Naturally, then, when scholars come across texts such as Jahiz's Fakhr al-Sudan, it's readily dismissed as parody, which is what Lewis's argument was when he discusses it. He says, well, you know, he looks like he's praising Black people, so it was obviously a joke, because it disrupts a distinct conceptualization of the world. Ibn al-Jawzi and Suyuti's contributions can be overlooked and ignored, though these works clearly traveled from Cairo to Timbuktu to Istanbul and were referenced freely for centuries. The various intellectual centers, such as Timbuktu, the Malian dynasties that flourished in Africa, can be marginalized as anomalies, because to accept that anti-Black racism has not always existed would necessitate an exploration of how and why this type of racism has become so commonplace within our contemporary world. And for scholarship in the West, that would perhaps be a far more introspective and certainly more daunting proposition. So I began today with a brief discussion regarding the way in which Islam has been framed as an Arab religion and the modern day implications of accepting this Orientalist categorization. I close with a fascinating tradition that captures a conversation between 8th century scholar Zuhri and the Caliph at the time. So the Caliph asked Zuhri, where do you come from? Zuhri responded, from Makkah. The Caliph asked, who has authority over the people there when you were present? Zuhri replies, Ata, is this man an Arab or a Mawla? Zuhri responds, a Mawla. How did he succeed in getting such influence over the inhabitants of Makkah? He replies, because of his religiosity and knowledge of the tradition. The Caliph replies, this is right. Men who fear God and are knowledgeable in tradition are to be the most eminent amongst men. Who is the most eminent man in Yemen? Daus ibn Kaysan. Is he of the Arabs of the Mawali? Zuhri responds, of the Mawali. How did he gain his influence? With the same qualities as Ata. And then the story runs on, and there are a number of the questions are repeated about various different centers of the Islamic empire. So we come to learn that the Haq holds authority in Khorasan, Ibrahim al-Nahi in Kufa, and so on and so forth. Now, whether this conversation actually happened or it was an imagined conversation is kind of beside the point. These names are known and have been transmitted throughout the ages as Islamic authorities. For those who are familiar with the legal or exegetical traditions, the names of Atah, Dahak, Nakhai are not particularly new. And the fact that non-Arab figures held such authority in early Islam contradicts the false categorization constructing Islam as a religion of Arab supremacy. Consider, for example, the fact, or I think it would be difficult, right? It's in fact inconceivable that within the first century of European colonialism, Indians or Africans could have been seen as authorities or governors of London or Paris or Lisbon within European empires. And I think this kind of distinction highlights the differences in the logics that govern these different societies. In fact, today I read and came to learn that Black and Asian soldiers who fought and died for this country in World War I and II were not even given gravestones because they were seen as undeserving, unlike their white colleagues. Now contrast that to the story of Adha, for example, and it really kind of highlights the problematic kind of conception of Islam as a religion of Arab supremacy, analogous to that of European supremacy and European colonialism. So just to close off then, the study of the relationships between different tribes and ethnicities within the Islamicate is crucial work, and it remains fertile ground for research and inquiry. However, any legitimate study must firstly be detached from a Eurocentric reading that simply seeks to use the history of the Islamicate as a tool to narrate and reaffirm stories about the exceptionality of the West. Ultimately, the study of Islamic history needs to be deracinated from its Orientalist roots for serious and legitimate research to be conducted. Thank you very much for listening. I'll finish there.